I could really spend all night, every night, doing nothing other than just highlighting to you some of the most hilarious and entertaining parts of the Democratic Party internal breakdown and implosion over the attempt by half of the party to drive Joe Biden from the race against his will, and the attempt by the other half of the party to defend Joe Biden from those efforts. The way in which Donald Trump has basically disappeared and gotten out of the way of the Democratic Party's civil war and self-destruction is remarkably unexpected. And honestly, whoever got Trump to do that, whoever convinced him that it was wise to basically stay out of the spotlight for all of these days now, deserves some sort of prize of some kind, because it's really an astounding feat that they've been able to get him to do that. And obviously, there's this old saying in law that when your opponent is imploding, the best thing to do is stay quiet. And that is exactly what, miraculously, Donald Trump has been persuaded by somebody to do. And as a result, what is happening is that the Democratic Party and their pundits and their operatives and their media allies and their elected officials are doing and saying things every day that, if you're engaged in politics, is actually quite hilarious, but it's also very revealing about their actual mindset. They are basically telling on themselves every single day with the way in which they're weighing in on this question of whether they should drive Joe Biden from the race involuntarily using power centers like Democratic donors and their media outlets and the like. The other day we showed you how Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist and the previous economist who has long been one of the Democratic Party's most stalwart and vocal partisan loyalists, had been saying for months, in fact years, that anyone who raised questions about Joe Biden's cognitive decline or his age was an extremely deceitful person, part of the right-wing disinformation machine, all of that. And like so many of the same people like him who have the same ideological disposition and the same kind of place in the media landscape, all of them instantly switched on a dime. I've never seen anything such a thing so abruptly before, where they had spent months and years saying that it is immoral and deceitful to say X. And then the next day, they all held hands and began chanting X in unison. X being that Joe Biden is obviously suffering from cognitive decline and is too impaired to run for president. And one of the really interesting parts about this, I will just note before I get to this new Paul Krugman pronouncement, is that Democrats aren't even pretending to care. They're not even pretending to care about the possibility that if Biden is reelected, it will mean that our country is governed by a cripple, by somebody who is mentally unwell, who often doesn't know where he is or what he's saying, who's completely controlled by people around him who are unelected and secretive. Those people and Biden control the nuclear code and whether to start wars and all kinds of unrestrained executive powers. And none of these Democrats are even pretending that they're concerned about Biden's cognitive decline, which they're only now admitting because they're forced to, might actually be a reason why he shouldn't be reelected. They don't even pretend about that. And that's because, despite all the things we hear about this being the most important election in all of history, who the president is doesn't actually matter all that much, which is why they're all fine with having a cognitive cripple there. And I can guarantee you without the slightest doubt that if Joe Biden were leading in the polls, as opposed to behind in every poll, all of these same Democrats and liberals who are now finally admitting what everyone has long been seeing with their own eyes would continue to hide it and insist that it's not real. And they would demand that nobody suggest this about Joe Biden. The only reason they've changed their minds is because they're fearful that Biden is running behind Trump, and that as a result of that debate, where even they can no longer deny the truth, he won't be able to defeat Trump. That's the only thing they care about. Now, that might go without saying, it might even surprise you, but I really think it's worth noting given how explicit they're being about it. And here's Paul Krugman today, just the latest of all those people to make clear how true that is. Paul Krugman is one of those people who spent years attacking viciously anyone who suggested Biden was incapable, and then suddenly when all of his liberal colleagues began doing it, he began to write these pain columns proclaiming his deep personal love and admiration and worship of Joe Biden, but saying that for the good of the country, the thing that he cares about as a patriot, he should step aside, that kind of tone. Here's Paul Krugman today now starting to face the reality that Joe Biden, far from being this good, decent man and this patriot who cares about anything other than himself, is actually going to stay in the race, despite what they all been saying is the inevitable outcome that means he'll lose to Trump. And now faced with that reality that Joe Biden is not going to do this self-sacrificing act of letting go of power for the good of the country. I mean, imagine how dumb you have to be, how gullible and naive you have to believe that Joe Biden, whose entire adult life has been about nothing other than pursuing power and title, is some benevolent, magnanimous person who would just voluntarily give up the thing he's been chasing his whole life for the good of some greater cause. These people live in an insane bubble. Ordinary Americans who don't pay attention to politics understand this. They're very jaded and skeptical and cynical about a politician's motives. It's only these people, the ones who get paid a lot of money to write about politics, who entertain these like West Wing fairy tales about the kind of thing that motivates Joe Biden. Look at all the things Joe Biden has done in his life. From vocally advocating the invasion of Iraq and the war in Iraq to being primarily responsible for extremely long prison sentences for people doing nothing other than possessing small amounts of drugs, only for him to then turn around and posture as some sort of empathetic figure to drug addicts when it came time for his own son. As the addict, do you know how many people Joe Biden is responsible for sticking in a cage for many years for nothing other than possessing small amounts of drugs, on top of which he has been basically an ardent supporter of almost every American war over the last 25 years and has, of course, spent the last 9 months blindly and limitlessly arming and funding Israel as it destroys Gaza and kills huge numbers of people. So where is this decency that we're all supposed to believe he has? So they're now all confronting the fact that actually Biden is like every other politician, something that you have to be incredibly dumb not to have seen before. And now this is the kind of thing they're saying. Quote, here's Krugman today, quote, "So I said what I thought needed saying about Biden, hating every minute as I did." Meaning I wrote 2 columns saying he should leave the race. "One thing I won't do, however, is snipe at him if he chooses to stay in. Anyone who does that is in effect campaigning for Trump and doing so out of sheer pettiness. Sheer pettiness. He's the one who wrote 2 articles saying that Biden is too impaired to beat Trump, to run and withstand the rigors of that campaign. And now he's saying that if Biden decides to stay in, everybody has to shut up about the fact that the current president of the United States, the one seeking 4 more years in office, is cognitively impaired and will get increasingly impaired. And anyone who raises that is doing so out of sheer pettiness. This is what I mean when they don't pretend to care at all if the current president or the future president has a melting or functionless brain. All of this about how Biden should leave for the good of the country is only about beating Trump. But these kinds of things are happening every day. I could show you so many more things where Democrats just contradict what they said the day before, where for the last 5 years, these people have insisted that it's immoral to launch character attacks on Joe Biden. Now they're routinely doing exactly that, comparing him to Donald Trump and to all of the worst character traits that they believe Biden is exhibiting. They just change the rules at any moment. But one of the more, and we'll get to all of that. We covered that last night. We'll certainly cover more in the future, the just unhinged nature of Democratic and liberal discourse over this problem that they've created themselves. They've spent weeks now telling the public that Biden is unwell and incapable to serve. And now they're stuck with the reality that Biden probably isn't going to leave and they have no power to force him out. So now they have to back a candidate who they've spent weeks screaming as loudly as they can is addled and unfit to serve as president. And there's no way to put that back in the box. I think they really believe, these media people and these DC operatives, that they continue to wield total power. No matter how often they see that their pronouncements don't mean anything, that nobody trusts them, that nobody pays attention to them. They've been screaming for 8 years that Donald Trump is the ultimate threat to democracy, and yet if you ask Americans in polls who the bigger threat to democracy is, Biden or Trump, they'll say Biden. These people in this bubble have no idea what ordinary Americans believe and no effect on them, but they haven't accepted that fact. They're so enraged that Biden didn't do what they demanded. to the point where they basically created this problem for themselves. And so one of the things that they're now trying to do that you are actually seeing is to rejuvenate the framework that is intended to convince Americans that the only reason they might be thinking negatively about Joe Biden or positively about Donald Trump is not because they actually have a mind of their own and are judging the two candidates based on how they remember his presidency, but instead it's because Russia, the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, is once again interfering in our sacred democracy and manipulating, brainwashing the public to believe what they want the public to believe, namely that Joe Biden is a weak candidate and Donald Trump is the better one. Here from the Wall Street Journal today, this is their headline story. I just want you to take note not only of what they're trying to claim, but of the language that they use to do it. The headline is, Russia seeks to boost Trump in 2024 election. And then you have here the famous and all-prevalent formulation in U.S. media, U.S. intelligence officials say. So the Wall Street Journal isn't purporting to verify that Russia is seeking to boost Trump in the 2024 election. All they're doing is mimicking mindlessly what, quote, U.S. intelligence officials say. And as I've said many times before, if you look at how most media reports are constructed, you'll be surprised if you actually go to look for it, how often major media outlets do not tell you what has actually happened. All they're doing is repeating what government officials have said to them. That was supposedly the lesson they learned with the Iraq War, where every story from the New York Times was Saddam Hussein is on the market for nuclear-only aluminum tubes, officials say. And every article was framed that way. And after they got everything wrong and provoked a war that killed over 1 million people and destroyed Iraq and thousands of American troops and trillions of dollars, they did a mea culpa where they said our problem was that we were too gullible and too willing to print what anonymous intelligence officials say without actually confirming what they were saying is true. And yet, barely 20 years later, that's what the New York Times and virtually every other media outlet does. This U.S. intelligence officials say it's not actually reporting, it's just a press release from anonymous people in the CIA. The Wall Street Journal goes on. Other foreign influence operations in the U.S. include attempts by Iran to covertly encourage protests against the war in Gaza, officials say. Quote, the Russian government has launched a, quote, whole of government effort. That's scary. It's not just parts of the government. It's the whole of government effort to influence the outcome of the U.S. presidential election and favors Republican candidate Donald Trump in the race, senior U.S. intelligence officials said on Tuesday. And then it goes on, quote, the officials, these are the only, I mean, do you see how everything, none of this is reporting? It's just repeating what they were told by the officials. The officials didn't mention Trump by name, but said that Russia's current activity, described as covert social media use and other online propaganda efforts, mirrored the 2020 and 2016 election cycles when Moscow also favored Trump and sought to undermine Democratic candidates, according to U.S. intelligence agencies. How can you be someone who calls yourself a journalist? I believe the reporter here, Dustin Volz, calls himself an investigative journalist or whatever, and day after day publish articles that do nothing other than summarize what CIA and FBI officials have just whispered to you in your ear that they want you to go and report, and then you just go dutifully quote them and publish it in the paper under your byline without having the slightest idea if it's true, without even pretending to know if it's true. You're just summarizing what they've told you to go say. Quote, we haven't observed a shift in Russia's preferences for the presidential race from past elections, a senior official in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence said during a media briefing summarizing intelligence on foreign threats to the election. So DHS called some of their favorite servants, who call themselves journalists, called them to a secret briefing at a really impressive part of the national intelligence apparatus with all these blinking lights and cool machines and secretive access. These journalists are so grateful to be there. And they had a little briefing. They said, here's what we found. Now go tell the American public this. And then they dutifully walk out and go do exactly that. Quote, the warnings underscore how U.S. adversaries are continuing to exploit social media platforms and other avenues to manipulate public opinion, despite efforts by the intelligence and law enforcement agencies to expose and crack down on the influence operations. Now, you know exactly why this is being published. It's because Joe Biden is behind Donald Trump in all the polls. The U.S. intelligence agency despises Donald Trump. And just like they did in 2016 and 2020, they will continuously leak to gullible reporters all kinds of assertions unaccompanied by evidence that are designed to make Americans believe that the only reason they have negative perceptions of Biden and positive perceptions of Trump is because they're too stupid to think for themselves, and instead the Kremlin is manipulating them. And I don't even have to go into the history and the severity of how much the U.S., quote, interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. They've shown you that many times. Now, lest you think I'm exaggerating this one story, here at the White House press briefing just today, the New York Times' David Sanger, who is one of their intelligence reporters, who has long been, and I've talked about many times before, written about many times before, one of the chief spokesmen for the CIA and the intelligence community of Washington. I mean, he spent his whole career doing exactly this sort of thing, just mindlessly rushing forward and publishing whatever the U.S. intelligence community tells him to write. That is his job. That's what he does. And today he took it to a whole new level. You have to hear this question that he posed to Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, at the White House briefing today about why it is that Americans might believe, inaccurately of course, that Joe Biden is too old to be president.
Denigrate politicians in the United States and elsewhere. Do you have any concerns right now that this is the leading edge of any part of a Russian effort to interfere in the election? Has the president been briefed on this? And have you seen any evidence that the Russians or other foreign powers have tried to seize on the debate performance to repeat some of the president's most embarrassing moments?
Did you see there how happy she was to get this question? How much she was nodding? I'm surprised she didn't strain her neck. I mean, there really is a reporter from the New York Times, David Sanger, who went to the White House briefing to encourage her to say that the reason that people are concerned about Joe Biden's debate performance is because the Russians are manipulating the footage in order to make Biden appear worse than he really is. That of course, there's nothing wrong with Joe Biden. It's just, unfortunately, people have been brainwashed to believe that there is, because of the Kremlin and all the naughty and dirty things that they do to deceive our American public. And he basically, he's not saying he has evidence of it. He's saying, have you had any evidence? Have you found things to suggest that this is true? And then listen to what she said. And for those of you who are listening to this and not seeing the video, while he asked the question, she couldn't wait to answer. She was smiling at him. She was nodding her head so aggressively. She couldn't wait to interrupt him to answer. And here's what she said when she finally got to.
So that's a very good question.
That's a very good question. I mean, imagine being at the White House press briefing and all of your colleagues are asking aggressive questions now about Biden's cognitive decline and whether they've been hiding facts. And then you finally stand up and feed them a line of propaganda that they even haven't claimed themselves. And then you get the little head pat from the White House press secretary. Thank you for that. Thank you for that suggestion. That's a very good question. Listen to what she goes on to say.
That's a very good question.
Very good question.
I would have to talk to our team about those particular questions that you just asked. There were multiple questions in your statement there. I would leave it to the Department of Justice as what they announced. Obviously, that's for them to speak to. Look, AI has always been a concern. That's why the president made some announcements recently, to take executive action on how we can deal with AI. We want to
denigrate.
Someone please tell me what AI has to do with the widespread perception that has existed for many years about Biden's cognitive impairment and how all Americans basically who watched that debate saw Biden's brain freezing and melting. She's basically implying that these videos are fake. This is, remember, when they were doing with all the other videos prior to the debate that show Biden disoriented and confused and not knowing where he was they were implying, with the help of the media, that all of this was just right-wing disinformation, that these videos were being doctored and manipulated and taken out of context. There was nothing wrong with Biden. They were what they called cheap fakes, meaning admitting that they were somehow genuine, but at the same time manipulated. So for a long time, this is what they were doing to hide Biden's cognitive decline and what the media was doing to run cover for the White House. And also, I want to just remind you of one other thing, which is the special counsel who was appointed to investigate whether Joe Biden committed crimes by having classified documents strewn over the place, at his house, at various offices, without the slightest authorization to have retained and lost and hidden those classified documents inside his garage, the thing for which Donald Trump is being prosecuted. The special counsel who was appointed to determine whether Biden should be prosecuted ended up concluding, after questioning Biden for many hours, that it would be impossible for a jury to convict Joe Biden because no jury would believe that Biden is capable of forming criminal intent. In other words, it's not enough to convict somebody of a crime to show that they did something the law prohibits, such as take classified documents home. You have to show that they did that with malicious intent, with criminal intent. It's the same thing if you are driving a car and you hit somebody without wanting to because they ran into the front of your car. That's a completely different act than if you take your car and with criminal intent deliberately kill somebody by running them over in a car because you dislike them or for whatever other reason. Even though they seem like on the surface to be identical acts, the major difference is whether they have criminal intent. And what the special prosecutor said is we could never prove to a jury that Biden is even capable of forming criminal intent because he just seems like an old man with memory problems. And he recounted all the different things that Biden was incapable of remembering that are shocking for somebody to have forgotten. And of course, there's video of this questioning by the special counsel. And yet the Democrats are fighting tooth and nail, the Justice Department is, to prevent disclosure to the public of this questioning. And before this debate, when Biden wanted to win, the media was fully supportive of this concealment of this video. We'll see whether or not it now surfaces, now that a lot of people have turned on Biden. But the argument that the Biden Justice Department and the Biden White House made as why that video had to be concealed was exactly the one she's alluding to here, which is that AI allows deep fakes and that they're concerned that there will be manipulation of these videos and deep fakes circulating. And that's why the public has no right to access this questioning and judge for themselves whether the special prosecutor was accurate in assessing Joe Biden's cognitive decline. This is their now go-to excuse for why they have to hide even things like videos. Here's the rest of this.
Legislatively from Congress, that is something. It is a cutting edge technology that we need to get our hands on and get a better understanding of what it could potentially do. And so that is something that the president certainly is looking to make sure that we deal with this in a full. Whole of government way. On those particular questions, I would have to check in with our team here, and obviously whatever's related to the Department of Justice in that statement, I would refer.
So that was 1 minute and 30 seconds of just uninterrupted propaganda, where she even threw in at the end, like, I have to check to see if we actually have evidence that any of these things are happening. But the whole point of that was to create this narrative, like the Wall Street Journal article, that Russia is responsible for negative perceptions of Biden. She was so happy to get the question that the New York Times fed to her. And by the way, just in case you're concerned, don't worry. Joe Biden is deeply investigating the dangers of artificial intelligence, the way in which they can be used to manipulate videos, and the safeguards that we need to ensure that can't happen. So if you are somebody who's worried about the dangers of AI and their capacity to manipulate the public, Joe Biden is on top of this. He's looking into it. He's presiding over commissions. He's fully understanding all of the different components of this problem, and he is finding solutions. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.